So thank you everybody for attending. This is our session tonight. And according to evolutionists, we're just mindless result of mutations from pond scum to people. And some single cell ancestor that mutated and through evolution now we're products of primates and apes. And they've held on to this dogma even in spite of the lack of evidence. So tonight we're going to look at some of the major discoveries that they've had. And we're going to point out some that are just outright lies, and some where they think they have a lot of evidence, and then we'll just show you exactly how weak that evidence is. And you'll notice that there is a definite evolutionary bias. And we'll see that in the media, every place you can look, every fossil that is uncovered, they will say this is the missing link. So we're going to see just what the scientists have discovered and how they have made monkeys out of man. And so we're going to start with this. From August 25th to August 29th, 2005, in London, England, in the zoo, this was the world's first ever human exhibit. And a group of the planet's most adaptable species, Homo sapiens, were seen frolicking and flaunting their natural behaviors in the natural world on what's called this famous Bear Mountain. One of the zoo spokeswomen gave this quote to CNN. "Seeing people in a different environment among other animals teaches members of the public that the human is just another primate." One of the volunteers said, a lot of people think humans are above other animals. When they see humans as animals, here it kind of reminds us that we're not that special. A visitor said, "It's hilarious. It turns everything upside down and it makes you think about the humans in relation to the animals." And another zoo spokesperson said, "We have set up this exhibit to highlight the spread of man as a plague species and to communicate the importance of man's place in the planet's ecosystem." Now, many of you will recognize this person. She would probably shoot me by having this picture up here, but this is our daughter, Sarah. And we took this at the Cincinnati Zoo in 2018. And we stopped by the gorilla exhibit, or the chimpanzee exhibit, and there's this quote from Jane Goodall. If you don't know who Jane Goodall was, she spent most of her career living amongst the monkeys and the apes and the chimpanzees, studying their social behavior, their family structure, and those kind of things. And so this quote from Jane says, "We are not, after all, the only beings with personalities, rational thought, and emotions. There is no sharp line dividing us from the chimpanzees and other apes. We humans are a part of, and not separate from, the animal kingdom." So why are scientists trying their hardest to make us related to apes? And I would say, if we have apes in our past, then there is no God. We're just mindless products of evolution. No one's over us in authority. We can make up our own rules. We can set our own morality, what's right, what's wrong. That's relative morality. Whatever we can get away with, that's okay. But if you have Adam in your past, God is your creator. He made us. He owns us. He's an authority. We live by his rules, and we're accountable to somebody. I think that's what it boils down to. We start our beginning here in Genesis 1, 26 and 27. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, in our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, over the livestock, over the earth, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female. He created them. And then we see Genesis 2:7. "The Lord formed the man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life." The Hebrew word there, nefesh chaya, the breath of life. "And the man became a living being." Now, all the other creation is if you remember, God just spoke and it came into being. But for humans, for man, he formed us out of the dust. That makes us different than the animals. He carefully formed us in his own image and then breathed into us the breath of life. Now, evolutionists will say that chimp DNA and human DNA are 98 to 99% similar. That's what you'll hear every time you ask somebody. Oh, we're so identical. We just differ by a few percentage points. But what you have to remember is that was based on a 1975 study, a pretty crude study, where they pre-selected similar genes from apes and humans. Folks, that's like me picking a chocolate-covered strawberry and a chocolate-covered grasshopper and saying, they're similar, well, only if you take the chocolate and compare the chocolate. But a grasshopper and a strawberry are not similar. Well, that's what they did in this study. They cherry-picked the data, and they said, well, these strands we know are similar, so let's compare those. At the time this study was done, there was no identical matchup between the DNA letters. Remember last time we talked about the little letters on the strand of DNA that code for specific amino acids and proteins? We didn't have enough data there to be able to align all the identical letters. In fact, it wasn't until 2001 that the full human genome was sequenced. And then the chimpanzee genome was not sequenced until 2005. And so in the 75 study, they said, well, we compared more than 19.8 million base pairs of chimp DNA and human DNA. That sounds like a lot, doesn't it? 19.8 million bases. But that's less than 1% of the human and chimp genome. Now, similarities since then, when scientists have now studied this, some scientists have said, maybe it's 98.5 to 95% similar instead of the 98 to 99%. But the using the percentages is a little misleading because the human genome, if you remember from last time, is made up of about 3.2 billion letters, right? And so if DNA differed by only 1%, this would amount to 32 million letters, which is enough to fill 10 Bibles. 5% would be 160 million DNA pairs, and you could fill 50 Bibles with that. So it's still a lot of information, even at 1% or 5% difference. Now, in 2012, there were 2 creation PhD scientists, genomists, and they did their independent study on the DNA after it was fully sequenced. And they said, when all the DNA is taken into consideration, and not just pre-selected parts, they found this. It is safe to conclude that human-chimp genome similarity is not more than 87% identical, and possibly not higher than 81%. Folks, that's huge. Now, as recent as 2018, there were 2 other independent studies that were done. One was by an evolutionary scientist and one by a creation scientist. And they looked at the same data, and the nucleotides in the genome that had an exact 1-to-1 match, human genome and chimp genome. Anybody want to venture a guess what that percentage was of similarities? Only 84.38%. Now, in addition to this, that represents 300 to 400 million DNA letters. But in addition to this, there were over 4% of the human DNA that didn't even appear in the chimp DNA at all. Not just DNA that was similar. No, this is information that doesn't even appear in the chimp DNA. And if you remember from last time talking about mutations, no mutation provides new information. We have not found one mutation yet that offers just a little bit of increase in information. So from an evolutionary standpoint, that's huge. And we'll talk about exactly how big that is. So why is it important to get a 98% similarity compared to an 84% similarity between the genes? And it's all about how much time it takes for mutations. And I'll talk about this in terms of an evolutionist talking about this. But when you wait for a neutral mutation, it doesn't take long at all. Remember, neutral mutations are neither detrimental or beneficial. They're just there. It may be a mutation that says, my left ear is a little bit different than my right ear. So those are neutral, and so those aren't a problem. There are 100 new mutations per person per generation of neutral ones. That's not, I mean, that's a fairly rapid pace. But creating the deleterious ones or the damaging ones, that happens all the time too. That's why we have diseases. That's why we have cancers and all these bad things that strike us. But it's difficult to have beneficial mutations. And I went over a couple of beneficial mutations, an increase in biological function. It made something a little bit better, but still no increase in information. And evolutionists will recognize it still takes quite a long time to get beneficial mutations. And they would say that the time required for just 8 specific beneficial mutations to occur would take more than 65 billion years. Folks, that's more than 4 times the supposed age of the universe in evolutionary time frame. So there's a definite problem here when you have to make up so many percentage points different, because otherwise your theory falls apart. The Smithsonian Magazine recognized that problem, and they had this quote: "Just a few percentage points can translate into vast, unbridgeable gaps between species." So for humans and chimps to have evolved over the 3 to 6 million years that they allege it took, you've got to have 98% similarity. If you have to make up 15% differences in their genes, folks, there just simply isn't enough time to do that. So that's why they're stuck on the 2% difference, because otherwise their theory completely falls apart. But DNA similarity isn't everything. The National Human Genome Research Institute director and many experts had an online genomic conference, if you will. And people were able to chat in on the National DNA Day. It was held in April 2010. And one of the questions was, how similar is human DNA to plant DNA? And this was the response. The basic structure of DNA, i.e. the double helix, is shared among all living organisms. We know that. The code or sequence of DNA, which are the instructions for our cells, is different. Even so, our DNA is likely more similar to plants than different. For example, we share approximately 60% of our DNA with a banana plant. There's the quote. I knew scientists were a little bananas, but that kind of took the cake, right? So tonight we're going to look at several of the fossil finds that evolutionists say are the missing links. But before I do that, you need to get a little bit educated on the things that they look for. So every paleoanthropologist will look at several of these that I've got on the screen here to determine whether something is primate or human. So we're going to look at a few of these here. Well, actually, I'm going to look at all of these real quick. First, let's look at the slope of the forehead. Obviously, in chimp or ape, the slope of the forehead is pretty drastic. Compared to the human, not quite 90, but a lot more. Maybe we're talking about 85% perpendicular here. Also, look at the nasal bone and the lack of the nasal bone on an ape. Take your finger, grab the tip of your nose, now wiggle it, that's cartilage, and then slide up your nose towards your eyes until you feel the hard bone that doesn't move. That's the nasal bone. That's where your glasses sit on. So apes don't have the nasal bone. What about the dental arcade? The dental arcade is the upper jaw and the rows of teeth in the upper jaw. You can see in the ape, that's more of a distinct U shape. In the human, it's got more of a V shape. It's tapered in a little bit. Also, there's what's called the diastema. The diastema is the space between the front teeth and then the canine teeth. We all have canine teeth. It's right here. Now, in apes, that space is bigger because the bottom canine is more pronounced. So when the ape or whatever has large canine teeth closes its mouth, it has a space for that canine tooth to fit. We don't have that big of a diastema. So there's another good point to look at when we look at skulls, human versus ape. This is called the foramen magnum. It is the hole. You're looking at the base of the skull here. Here you see the arcade, the dental arcade. This is the base of the skull. This is the hole in the occipital bone, or the base of the skull, where your spinal column and your vertebrae go to attach your head. It makes sense that in a chimpanzee or an ape, that is much more at the back, because they're walking on all fours, and so they don't have to tip their head up as much as we do. It's just kind of hanging there. In a human, it's almost dead center in the skull because we walk upright. We call that bipedal walking. Ped is foot, bi is two 2 feet. We walk on 2 feet. And so it makes sense that that foramen magnum is in the center for balance. So we'll look at some examples of that. The temporal muscles in an ape compared to a human are much larger. That's because God created them to chew a different diet. Much more, harder digestible things. So those muscles have to be stronger. They're larger temporal muscles, and there's what's called the zygomatic arch. Now, the temporal muscles, again, pull the jaw up, but they go through the zygomatic arch. In chimps and apes, that zygomatic arch has to be a little more pronounced to fit bigger muscles up through. That makes sense, everybody? Humans don't have that big of a zygomatic arch because our temporal muscles aren't that big. We have a much different diet. God created us that way. The brow ridge. This is basically your eyebrows. This is a structural part of your skull that's harder than the rest of the bones in your face. And that's because it provides structure to the eye sockets. If you have strong temporal muscles, like apes do, if you didn't have a strong, well-defined brow ridge, your eye sockets would collapse if you start chewing something that's very hard. Humans don't have that big of a brow ridge, but that in and of itself isn't the distinctive feature, and I'll show you why here in a second. The other thing that you need to be aware of is in apes, a side view, you can't see the eyes. In humans, the eyes are visible even from the side. Glance over at your neighbor while the other one's looking straight ahead. You can see their eyes. Now, again, I said brow ridge isn't the only thing that separates apes from humans. This guy's got a pretty big brow ridge, wouldn't you say? This is a Russian boxer. Is he a chimpanzee or an ape? I wouldn't call him that to his face, for sure. And there are many other people. Jay Leno, everybody remember Jay Leno? Jay Leno's got a pretty pronounced brow ridge, and there are many, many others. So that in and of itself does not distinguish between human and ape. Now, the group of bones here, the tailbone, what's called the ischium, that's the bone you're sitting on right now. And then the ilium blades or the hip blades, these all make up what's called the pelvic girdle. The pelvic girdle is important because evolutionists will look at the pelvic girdle and they'll determine whether somebody walked bipedally upright or whether they were walking on all fours, what we call knuckle walking. In humans, it's much more of a bowl shape, where the pelvic girdle, the pelvic bones actually curve and they're almost parallel. In chimps, you see the blades are longer and they're flatter, and then in the apes, much larger, more the size of a human, but they are flat. They don't curve around much at all. Now, the people will say that, well, again, this is a sign of bipedal walking, but not necessarily. We'll look at that here shortly. You can see in this sketch then how the ape pelvis is more adapted to knuckle walking. It's a flatter plate in the back, but humans, it kind of cradles all of our organs too, right? It's like a bowl that all of our organs sit in. Now remember, there are some primates that are bipedal. They do walk on 2 feet, not very well, not like us, but you've seen them. You've seen them walk on 2 feet, so it is possible that you can walk on 2 feet even though you don't have a nice, well-rounded pelvic girdle. So that in and of itself is not a real definer of whether you were able to walk bipedally or not. Finally, the carrying angle, or what's also called the valgus angle. It's the angle that's formed between the knee and the lower leg and the thigh bone here. In humans, that valgus angle or carrying angle is about 81%. In gorillas, that's almost 90 degrees at the knee joint. That's why it's extremely important for anthropologists to find knee joints, because they'll say, oh, well, that will tell us the valgus angle or whether the person was walking bipedally or not, upright. But that's not a prime example either, because some orangutans and some spider monkeys also have a valgus angle or carrying angle about 81% or 81 degrees. So that in and of itself, again, is not, critical to say human or ape. A lot of the chimpanzee or like the spider monkey or the orangutan, they walk along branches with their feet and they hold on to vines or other branches on top. But they balance themselves that way. God created them to live up in the trees. Now, we're going to look at some starting assumptions for evolutionists, and these won't be a surprise to you. All human origins must be explained in purely naturalistic terms apart from any creator God. That's number one. Their number one assumption is that man has evolved into apes. You will find no serious paleontologists or paleoanthropologists that will say, did man evolve into apes? It's a foregone conclusion. It's just from which ape did we evolve from. There is no question that it was from an ape. Which one? So those are the starting assumptions that they're all making. So let's see what the evidence has been over time. Oh, first, there's much more prestige in finding a fossil of an ancestor of a man than just another ancestor of a living ape, right? You want to be the one that finds the new missing link. So is there a tremendous amount of pressure placed on these guys if they want their paper published, if they want their name recognized? Everything they find will be the missing link. That's where we're starting from. Just remember that. So let's start back in 1912, and these are not necessarily in any particular order, just kind of grouping. You'll find out why I'm grouping them this way. But in 1912, Charles Dawson was an amateur archaeologist, and he was initially credited with the discovery of the missing link between humans and apes. And this was called Piltdown Man. He found a skull-like or some fragments in gravel beds near a village called Piltdown in England. And he wrote to his friend Arthur Smith Woodward. He was the keeper of geology at the Natural History Museum. And he was interested in the find. So the two started working together to see if they could find more. This is what was recorded in the Illustrated London News on December 28, 1912. Looks very much like an ape with the sloping forehead, right? So that's the missing link. It's said in the London Illustrated, a discovery of supreme importance to all who are interested in the history of the human race was announced at the Geological Society on Wednesday evening, December 18th, when Mr. Charles Dawson of Lewes and Dr. A. Smith Woodward, the keeper of the Geological Department of the British Museum, displayed to an eager audience a part of the jaw and a portion of the skull of the most ancient inhabitant of England, if not in all of Europe. The remains thus far recovered leave no possible doubt that they represent not merely a fossil man, but a man who must be regarded as affording us a link with our remote ancestors, the apes, and hence their surpassing interest. So what did he find that left no possible doubt? A jaw with a couple of teeth, some skull fragments, and some primitive tools that were somewhere close by. And he said that these belonged all to the same individual. Now, when they were first discovered, they were dated, and they were dated at 500,000 years old. They later dated them in 1949 with some newer techniques. They were only 50,000 years old. Well, that's a problem because by that time, hominids had already fully developed into full Homo sapiens. So who needs the missing link at that point in time? But that was the story. Now, we later discovered in 1953 that the skull and the jaw fragments actually came from two different species. The skull was human, and they dated it with carbon-14, and it was only 520 to 720 years old. The jaw was from an orangutan that was 50 years older. What about the missing link there? Now, there were scratches on the tooth that would have been visible under a microscope, and they've looked at those since. That's where they discovered that this was a hoax, but the teeth had been ground down to make them look like human and to make them look older. They ground down the canine teeth so much that the pulp chamber showed. So he had to fill in, Dawson had to fill in the pulp chamber, and then he stained them to match the gravel, the color of the gravel that they were found in, supposedly found in or planted in. Now, I'm just going to say, any skilled anthropologist that would have looked through the microscope at these teeth would have come to either one of two conclusions: that it was a hoax, or it was the world's first root canal. But this persisted for 41 years after the original discovery before they found out it was a hoax. So we found out this was a fraud. As I began, some of these are outright lies. Now, Harold Cook was a rancher. This takes us to Nebraska man. Harold Cook was a rancher in northwestern Nebraska, and as he was ranching, he found what he thought was a primitive tooth. And so he took the primitive tooth to Henry Fairfield Osborne, who was a paleontologist, and he immediately took note of that and said, well, this is clearly an early ape man, probably closer to man than ape. And they were actually going to use this tooth as evidence in the Scopes monkey trial with William Jennings Bryan, but it was getting so much negative publicity that they decided they weren't going to go there. But they thought about using it as evidence for the animal ancestry of man. This is the illustration of Nebraska man, including his wife, from one tooth. published in the Illustrated London News, June 24th, 1922. All of this, just artist license, just from a tooth. You don't think there's bias there, that we've already evolved? It just depends on who we evolved from. Now, a paleoanthropologist, Grafton Elliott Smith, he had previously been involved in the Piltdown scandal. He's the one that was promoting this to the London Illustrated. There's the tooth. Interestingly enough, in 1927, other parts of the skeleton were discovered, and they found that it was an ancient extinct pig called a peccary. That's what the tooth belonged to. The Science Journal, or Journal of Science in 1927, immediately yanked that as being the missing link, obviously. But it continued to be exhibited in Morrill Hall at the University of Nebraska until the 1970s. Steve, you graduated from there. I graduated from there. Did you ever go into Morrill Hall?
Yeah.
Did you? I went there as a kid in grade school on a field trip. I saw the picture of the ape family. I saw the tooth. There was nothing that said this was from a pig. That persisted for a long time. This is a case when a pig made a monkey out of a man. Just saying. So we find out, again, this is a fraud. This is, again, in no particular order, this is a find that they called Eosinous. This was a candidate that they found a fossil for in 2000 that was supposed to be, again, our ancestor, ape to human, and it was found, the fossils were found in China. And this is the beautiful picture that was represented in the Times Magazine, March 27, 2000. They said in the write-up that it was supposed to be a shy, nocturnal animal that had large saucer-like eyes and flitted about the treetops. Now, when you see pretty pictures like this, artist renditions, the question that you should always ask yourself is, what's the evidence? Right? That's the question I want you all to ask. What's the evidence? Are you ready for the evidence? They found a piece of a jawbone and a piece of an ankle bone no bigger than a couple of grains of rice. They're supposed to be from a thumb-sized monkey that flitted about the treetops with big saucer-like eyes and a nocturnal. How do you know that from a jawbone and a heel bone or an ankle bone? How do you draw a nice pretty picture showing what the representation of that looked like? Well, this hits close to home because over in KU, there's the professor here, Christopher Beard. He's a paleontologist. He works on a lot of these fragments that they find in China. In his paper, he said, at the most fundamental level, why do people care about human evolution at all? They care because people want to know how, where, and when did we evolve? How did people come into existence? It's almost a metaphysical question. I would say it is. Let's move on to Pithecanthropus erectus. Just know him as Java Man. That's his nickname, Java Man. He was found, or these bones were found, by a Dutch physician, Eugene Dubois, in the Dutch East Indies. He found a thigh bone, which he said was clearly human, and it looks human. And he also found 3 teeth. Notice there's only one shown here in the display. We'll get to that. And he found a skull cap. And despite the evidence of only having 3 teeth, this is how Java Man was pictured. How do you get that from 3 teeth and a thigh bone? But he found his missing link, and that's really all that mattered. The skull cap and the leg bone were not necessarily from the same individual. They were found 50 feet apart. Can it be conclusively stated that those are from the same critter, whatever this was? But it didn't matter, even in spite of Dubois had received information from an authority that said 2 of those teeth are gorilla, only 1 of them is human, and as well, the Dubois, he found 2 other full human skulls within a radius of about 65 miles from where Java Man was supposedly found, but he didn't tell anybody for over 30 years because he didn't want to take the fact that there were already humans alive in the evolutionary thinking. Now, there's still some problems. People still don't know if the femur bone and the skull cap came from the same individual. The problems are that if they are from the same species, well, there goes your missing link, right? Humans have always existed. If they were from different species, they must have been contemporary with one another. They lived at the same time. We didn't need one to evolve into the other. They're 2 distinct species. However, this skull belongs to what they term Homo erectus, which is real man. They just don't give it real human status, but it is real man. Now, the next one on our list is called Cehelianthropus tacadensis. Don't let the word scare you, but anthropos is a Greek word that means man. So they've already assigned this in the name that this is man. But there's much disagreement to this because when this was initially reported, it was touted as the oldest ancestor and the most significant find in living memory. That's a pretty big statement. However, a few days later, an alternative explanation was given by other people who saw it. They said that it looks more like a female gorilla. The original fossil is shown here in the lower right hand. It was pretty badly damaged, not really recognizable. This one up here is supposedly the original that was just cleaned up and made pretty. This is the one that was reconstructed. What have you learned about looking at the base of the skull that would give you a clue of what this is? The foramen magnum. You see the human foramen magnum down here, dead center in the skull. You see the female gorilla where the foramen magnum is located. Kind of amazing, but that looks like it's in the exact same spot as a female gorilla. However, they've already given it the name man, right? But you can also look at the zygomatic arch here. See how large that is to pass all those large muscles through from the jaw up to the temple muscles? So after 27 years, there's still no consensus among the science community what this critter actually was. I think they need to go back to the textbooks and say, well, look at the foramen magnum. It's pretty clear to me. What about Artie? Ardipithecus rhamnus. Again, pithecus in this case means ape. So they've assigned this ape, part man. The missing link was given heavy publicity after they discovered this in the paper called Nature, 1994. So again, what should you ask? What's the evidence, right? So they found 10 teeth, kind of all gathered in a specific area. They found a couple of fragmented limb bones, 885 feet away. 2 skull pieces that were heavily chewed, like somebody had been gnawing on them. They were 1,800 feet away. There were other scraps, bits and pieces that were found almost a mile away. They said that all these bones were from the same individual. If so, this was the worst first terrorist bomber. He scattered all over. So how do paleontologists know that all these belong to the same individual? They don't. It's clear. Let's move on to Ardipithecus cadava. This was in 1997. This was a hominid that supposedly walked bipedally on the basis of a single toe bone that was discovered. Now, you'll see other bones that they found later, but these are the bones. Now, I said a single toe bone. What are the rest of these? Well, this first column is that single toe bone that was photographed from 3 different viewpoints. The other ones are pencil drawings of the pictures that they put side by side of it. You can see very similar things here, very similar things here. Pictures and drawings just at different angles. So they didn't find as many things as you think they found. So that's the other question to ask is, what are the real bones here? Now, it's amazing because the toe bone is dated several 100,000 years younger than some of these other bones here, and almost 10 miles away in a different rock stratum. Now, from an evolutionary perspective, they think that we have all these rock stratums that were slowly deposited one sand grain at a time over millions and millions of years. So things at the bottom of the layer would be older than the things at the top of that rock layer. The rest of the toe bones were spilled out over an area almost 12 miles long. Now they believe that all these bones belong to about 5 different species that were from 5 different locations. So next, let's move on to Homo habilis, 1960. Homo habilis was also called handyman because of some human tools that were found supposedly nearby. This was found by Louis Leakey. You probably recognize that name. And it's now considered to be a mixture of more than one fossil type since the fragments were cast over such a large area. But it's interesting because this is supposed to be fossil evidence for the oldest evidence of right-handedness found in a jawbone. I see y'all scratching your head. How can you tell if somebody was right-handed or not by the jawbone? Well, they've said that this belonged to an ape man who used stone tools. And so when you hold a piece of meat in your mouth with your non-dominant hand, and you take another rock tool and you try to cut a hunk off, you may have nicked your tooth. And so they found scratches supposedly in the tooth that were because somebody was trying to saw off a piece of meat with their right hand. Folks, you can't make this stuff up. I'm just saying, you can't make this stuff up. So yeah, those were the diagonal scratches they said were in the teeth. Homo habilis is a very complicated thing to describe, and no 2 researchers agree on what this specimen was, or even whether it belonged to the genus, Australopithecus, or the hominid status. Let's move on to Homo heidelbergensis, otherwise known as Boxgrove man, because it was found in a rock quarry in Boxgrove, England. It was supposed to be an ancestor of the Europeans. And again, what was the evidence? A piece of shin bone that looked like it was human, and then some primitive tools that were found supposedly nearby. The only evidence that they had other than this shin bone were 2 teeth. And the Sydney Morning Herald of May 19, 1994 called this one of the most important finds in the history of human evolution. 2 teeth and a shin bone. That's pretty spectacular. Now, given the fact that there are only 2 teeth and a shin bone, you can imagine the picture that was drawn of this critter, right? There he is. This was clearly human, but they reconstructed this from 2 teeth as clearly an ape head. And I think, a lot of Christian scientists have looked at this and said, we know a lot about Homo heidelbergensis because we found other skulls from this. Here's one that was, again, all of these are Homo heidelbergensis. This one was discovered in Zambia. Here's one in South Africa, Zambia, France, and here's one in Germany. All of these are clearly human. You can tell, even though there's a bigger brow ridge, what do we know about brow ridges? They don't really say a thing about whether it was ape or human. But you can see the nasal bone on these that have one. You see almost a vertical slope to the head. Can't really see whether this is V-shaped. It certainly looks a little more V-shaped here. But certainly the zygomatic arch is not well defined here. So these are human beings, and they lived all over the world. And they migrated across the globe. So all this reminds me of this statement made by Nigel Hawkes in the Times London in 1995. It says, "Few sciences produce such abundant returns from so few fragments of fact as paleontology." You gotta get an amen to that. Yeah. Remember this when you pick up the newspaper next time. You read an article that says, "We've got the missing link." Right? I need a unanimous. What's the question that you ask? Give us the evidence. So this next one is everybody probably recognizes this. This is a 3-foot 7-inch tall specimen. One of the most famous discoveries ever made by Donald Johanson. It was discovered in 1974 in what's called the Afar region of Africa. It's up there by Ethiopia. It is what's called Australopithecus afarensis. You'll hear that term a lot. There are multiple Australopithecines. Some you'll see Australopithecus africanus. This one is called afarensis from the Afar region. That's where it gets its name. Just call her Lucy, because that's what everybody else calls her. This was supposed to be, again, hailed as the missing link, and it's so valued because look at the number of bones that were found. They say that this is approximately 40% of a complete skeleton. What's missing? Hands and feet. There's a lot of bones in the hands and feet, and so when you count those, this is only about a 20% complete fossil. Now, the claim is that all of these bones belong to the same individual, but they had to sift through 20 tons of dirt that they grabbed from an area about 540 square feet, and that's how they found all these. So, can we be sure that it all came from the same critter? In 2015, it was actually discovered that one of the bones actually belonged to a baboon. So there goes the whole concept that all of this belonged to the same individual. But even though there are no hands and feet on the skeleton, we see them in museums everywhere. These are just a couple exhibits, one in Chicago in the Field Museum, and another one here in the London Natural History Museum, they depict Lucy as being almost human. Look at the hands and the feet. Clearly shows hands and feet. Here's another one. This is in the an exhibit of Lucy in the St. Louis Zoo. I think Donald Johanson actually also captured a fossilized thought. I wonder if I put the fire out of the cave when I left this morning. You know, how they're giving these people, or these things, human-like qualities. Now, look at the hands and the feet here. With a little nair and some creative thinking, this could be human hands and feet. Now, there were other fossils that were found since 1974 that had the feet that they still classified as Australopithecus afarensis. They did not have human feet. They were more chimp-like than human. A research paper stated that the hands and the feet of Australopithecus afarensis are not at all like human hands and feet. Rather, they have long curved fingers and curved toes, typical of arboreal primates. Arboreal means that they lived in trees. They needed longer toes, they needed longer fingers to get a good grasp of the branches. Now, at the time this exhibit was made in St. Louis, they had all the evidence that they needed to say we can't put human feet on this. But the zoo director said, yeah, we cannot be updating every exhibit based on every new piece of evidence. What we look at is the overall exhibit and the impression it creates. We think the overall impression this exhibit creates is correct. What's the overall impression that they wanted to create? That we're from apes, right? Again, outright lies, even though they know the truth. Now, in 1973, Johanson found a knee joint. That's what we've been looking for. A knee joint so they could tell whether this critter walked upright or not. This is given the name AL129, 1A, and 1B. That's how they numbered this. And it was found in rock stratum. First of all, they said this is all from the same individual as Lucy was. The same, not the same skeleton as Lucy, but the same species, the Australopithecines. They said they found this, it was about 1.5 miles away from the Lucy site, but it was 230 foot deeper in the rock stratum. What does that mean? If it's lower in the rock stratum, and that means it lived earlier than that what was found above in terms of evolutionary thinking, we would take a different view. We would say that people were just buried at different times because of the flood. But according to evolutionists, then the knee joint that showed bipedal walking, or evidence for it, happened before Lucy. So that means what? It means Lucy had to have human feet, right? That's what they say. That's why they're ignoring the evidence that Lucy did not have human feet. I'll show you a little bit more information here. So yes, if this is true, bipedalism existed years before Lucy. So again, why is there such need to show that Lucy had human feet? Number one, because a knee joint showed that it was bipedal walking. It was found earlier, so Lucy had to have feet. Here's another reason. This is a picture of fossilized footprint trail in Litoli, Tanzania. It's about 88 feet long, and there's about 70 different what look like human tracks. They were fossilized footprints in wet volcanic ash. Now, it was interesting because they say they were found in the same rock layer as Lucy. Well, there you go. There's clear evidence that Lucy made these human tracks. There's a little bit of a difference here because this is Latoli, Tanzania. This is the Afar Triangle in Africa. That's over 1,000 miles away. Nobody thought to ask the real important data here. But even then, they were dated 400,000 years older than Lucy was. So even though they're in the same rock layer, again, this is evolutionary dating methods, right? We don't believe that they're that old. But Johansen said these footprints have to belong to Lucy. Mary Leakey's the one that found these. And you'll notice here, the one on the left is much smaller than the one on the right. It's interesting because you can look in some of these, and I don't have a good picture of those, but in some of these, there's a third footprint smaller in the center of the larger ones. They say that these had to belong to a more ape-like individual because the stride is so short, and apes have shorter legs, therefore the stride is shorter. Who's ever walked through snow? I have. When you've walked through a lot of snow for a long time, especially if you walked from here to the Afar Triangle, which is 1,000 miles away, you're not going to have the longest stride. And if you're walking in wet volcanic ash, you're going to be walking a little more careful than just your full 3-foot stride. Also, who's been a little kid before? Who's ever got tired? You're still a little kid. I'm just kidding. She's my A student in my class. Who has walked in the footprints of their dad in the snow? Because it's easier walking. You don't have to make your own path. Right? But that's the evidence. But these footprints had to have been made by Lucy, and therefore Lucy had to have human feet to be this bipedal walker that they've said. Here's a close-up picture. This wasn't a real good one of the footstep in the middle, but notice the big toe that is basically aligned with the other toes. Now, you know, when you walk, you push off with your big toe. And so for humans, we use that to spring our step. Compare that with the ape foot. Does that toe look like the ape? Certainly doesn't to me. Now, they took some digital photogrammetry and they compared this to a modern human footprint. This is the modern one on the right. This is the Latoli print on the left. And the colors that you see here are increasing impact of force. So the darker the red here, the more impact that the foot had. And so you can see a really dark area in the heel. You plant your heel first when you take a step, and then you roll forward onto the ball of your foot. Notice also a pretty well-defined arch in the human. Well, what would you expect if you're walking in wet ash? It's not going to be as defined, but you can clearly see an arch, you know, with the red here and the force that foot struck. So, you know, clearly these footprints pose a problem for evolutionists because, according to them, modern humans hadn't developed yet. People say, why haven't you ever found human footprints in old ancient strata? Here they are. We're looking at it. But here's something else. Scientists still had a problem. Lucy's type had to be the one that made these footprints at Latoli. However, the hips of Lucy were not hips that were conducive to bipedal walking. That's a huge problem. You have human-like feet, even though she didn't, but they're saying she had human-like feet. You better have human-like hips. You better have a human pelvic girdle so you can walk upright. This was the solution. This is a clip from PBS called In Search of Human Origins, Part 1. You can't find this on YouTube anymore. Or at least the link that I had copied this earlier had been pulled off. This one aired June 3rd, 1997. Donald Johanson, who found Lucy, is the one that's narrating this piece. And Owen Lovejoy is the man here that you're going to see with the fossil of, or a similarity of the fossil of Lucy. I'm going to put this down for a second so you can hear. And I'm going to play this clip for you.
The ape that stood up, it was a revolutionary idea.
Oh, hold on.
We need Owen Lovejoy's expertise again.
Is my volume turned up there? I may just have to hold it here.
Because the evidence wasn't quite adding up. The knee looked human, but the shape of her hip didn't. Superficially, her hip resembled a chimpanzee's, which meant that Lucy couldn't possibly have walked like a modern human. But Lovejoy noticed something odd about the way the bones had been fossilized.
When I put the two parts of the pelvis together that we had, this caused the two bones, in fact, to fit together so well that they're in an anatomically impossible position.
The perfect fit was an illusion that made Lucy's hip bones seem to flare out like a chimp's. But all was not lost. Lovejoy decided he could restore the pelvis to its natural shape. He didn't want to tamper with the original, so he made a copy in plaster. He cut the damaged pieces out and put them back together the way they were before Lucy died. It was a tricky job, but after taking the kink out of the pelvis, it all fit together perfectly, like a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle. As a result, the angle of the hip looks nothing like a chimp's, but a lot like ours.
Folks, you can't make this stuff up. All you have to do is grind it, shape it, however you want to do it so you get the result that you need. I understand why they pulled this off of YouTube, right? This, astounding, that's all I can say. Astounding. So even with the evidence that is stacking up against Lucy as being this missing link, you still see all of this reconstruction bias in all of these museum exhibits and everything. Here's one in the Cleveland Museum of Natural History. The artist said, "I wanted to get a human soul into this ape-like face to indicate something about where she was headed." First of all, what do you notice? Well, is that lipstick? What shade is that, ladies? Midnight on the Harbor or what? Look at the eyes. What monkey or ape do you know that has white eyes? Zip. Nada. But they have to do this to do what? To make it look human. Again, you can't make this stuff up. Now, here's a source that I trust. This is at the Answers in Genesis Creation Museum. If you haven't been there, you need to go. It's just across the river from Cincinnati. And while you're there, go to the Ark Encounter. You guys went to the Ark Encounter.
Yes, it was great.
Yeah, there you go. Eyewitness there. You got to go. They have this exhibit. The facial structure of all of these is identical. What's changed is the hair, the skin tone, and the eyes. Maybe a little lipstick here. Which interpretation of this is correct? Unmistakably a monkey. Now, look at the evidence here and compare this. These are the same bones that were found in Lucy. There are two ways to reconstruct these. One, now notice that all of the limb bones were fractured. And so you don't know how long they were. So you can either shorten up the distance between the bones to make the arms shorter so they're more human-like, because chimps and apes have longer arms, like this one where they can be spread apart. But then they separated the bone fragments farther in the legs, because humans have longer legs, compared to if you space those closer together, they're more chimp-like. So it starts now, you start seeing the bias. This is also an exhibit in the Creation Museum. They picked some of the bones here of the hip joint and the femur and the skull, and they actually superimposed these on what the animal really looked like. Folks, Lucy was nothing but a chimp. We've just given her human characteristics because they had to. Now, in 1981, Richard Leakey wrote a book called The Making of Mankind, which he stated, "We can now say that Australopithecines, of what Lucy was, definitely walked upright." But in 1982, Richard Leakey was invited to speak at the Royal Institution of London. They've had a prominent speaker on every Friday night for the last 200 years. Leakey was invited to speak there in 1982, a year after he made that first statement. There was a reporter at that lecture that recorded what Leakey said in 1982. He said, Leakey points out that paleontologists do not know whether Australopithecus walked upright. Nobody has yet found an associated skeleton with a skull, he says. Why do you need the skull? With the foramen magnum, it tells you whether it was bipedal walking or not. The article went on to say, I'm staggered to believe that as little as a year ago, and this is Johansson speaking, I'm staggered to believe that as little as a year ago, I made the statements that I made. Or I should say Richard Leakey, I mean. Yeah, I'm kind of staggered that he made those statements too. And then he said he had come to reveal that the conventional wisdom which he had so recently espoused in his BBC television series, which was made out of the book, Making of Mankind, was probably wrong in a number of crucial areas. Can't believe he even made the statement. At least he published this. It concludes by saying, in particular, and this is a reporter speaking, he now sees man's oldest ancestor as being considerably younger than the 15 and 20 million years he plumped on for TV. Leakey says that the basis on which paleontologists classify fossils and apes and humans is misleading, and he would like to see an entirely fresh episode of classifying. You think he wants to make that more from a biblical narrative? No, not at all. But there is a lot of problems that they need to fix, and he recognizes that. Since the discovery of Lucy, there have been other scientists that have found, like I said, Australopithecines, and they have disputed the fact that Lucy walked upright. Here's a quote. says measurements of the shape of wrist bones, what's called the distal radius, show that Lucy's types were knuckle walkers similar to gorillas. Here's another quote from Science News. A. anamensis and A. afarensis, Australopithecus, the latter, represented by the famous skeleton known as Lucy, had wrists capable of locking the hands in place during knuckle walking. And that's what you see in apes. We didn't talk much about that, but your wrist bones have a natural lock if you're a chimpanzee or an ape. I don't know, how many people have done push-ups? Yeah, if you do a lot of push-ups, your wrist bone starts hurting, so it's not advantageous for you to be a knuckle walker if you have to provide a lot of pressure with your wrist bones. So they lock in place if you're a knuckle walker. Now researchers have unveiled an incredible find of a skeleton that's also classified as Australopithecus afarensis. This time it's a child skeleton that was found just 2.5 miles from the Lucy site. Now only the bones that are shaded in brown are what's been found. A little bit more of the feet, no pelvic girdle. You have a rib cage, we'll talk about that here in a bit. I failed to mention that before. But they say that the shoulder blades and the neck are clearly vertebrae like a gorilla. You notice they're kind of upswept, like you would be hanging onto branches. Also, the inner ear canals, I guess they can tell whether humans or apes have ear, there's a distinct difference in the ear canal. Some of that is balance. We get our balance from our inner ear. She had long curved fingers. Well, we at least see one here, but from other fossils they've said, yes, they're definitely longer fingers, more chimp-like, like a tree-dwelling ape. A voice box like a chimpanzee's, a cranial capacity like a chimp, and a conical-shaped rib cage like a chimp. Now, you'll see it looks like a cone. It starts up here at the top, and then it flares out at the bottom. The difference between a chimpanzee and a human is a human's is more barrel-shaped all the way around. So clearly, instead of calling this a stunning new human fossil, if all these things look like a gorilla or a chimpanzee, then I call it a stunning new gorilla fossil. That doesn't sell much books, though, do they? Now, Charles Oxnard, a scientist, he developed a computer program that was very sophisticated. You plug in bones and all of their measurements, and it will tell you, supposedly, whether they're human or whether they're more ape-like. And so he fed Lucy's bones into this sophisticated computer program, and he says, in each case, although initial studies suggest that the fossils are similar to humans, or at the worst intermediate between humans and African apes, study of the complete evidence shows that the reality is otherwise. These fossils clearly differ more from both humans and African apes than do these two living groups from each other. The Australopithecus or Australopithecines are unique. So now many people think that Lucy is just an extinct monkey type that's made of a complete number of jumbled bones, but certainly unique and not even related remotely to humans after this comparison. Getting to the end here of these examples. Neanderthal man. Who's heard of Neanderthal man? Yeah, almost everybody. It was discovered in 1829 in France. And it was from a preserved skeleton, generally just the head. In 1909, these are some of the pictures that we had. Clearly, initially, just from the skull, it was this brutish-looking critter that carried a club. Obviously, you needed to give it a weapon to make it more human-like, right? But clearly, they had to make it ape-like, so they covered it with hair. You can see the pictures as time has passed on. This is a fairly recent one. But as more evidence has surfaced based on Neanderthal, they indicate that they had very fine motor skills because they could thread pieces of shell on a piece of string. So you need pretty fine motor skills for that. And now here are, from a number of different museums around the world, here are the new representations of Neanderthal. This is clearly a man, clearly a woman, clearly a male boy, and another child. Why the change? These are human beings. That's because they are human, fully human, just like you and me. And they finally had to show the true data because it was so overwhelming. Researchers have shown that Neanderthals walked upright just like modern humans. Imagine that. Here's a detailed study that was made between the vertebrae and the pelvic area, and they said clearly this has an S-shaped spine. It says here, on the whole, there is hardly any evidence that would point to Neanderthals having a fundamentally different anatomy. Now is the time to recognize the basic similarities between Neanderthals and modern humans. Neanderthals walked upright just like the humans of today, and this was from the University of Zurich. Now, in 1978, there were these two bones that were found in a cave in Greece. The one on the left is just the top, the left side of the brain case of the skull. They said clearly human, right? Dated at 210,000 years old by evolutionary dating methods. The one on the right, Neanderthal, dated 170,000 years old. Well, if Neanderthal is something that we evolved from, why is the human skeleton older? Also, these two skulls were found in the same rock, no bigger than the size of a microwave oven, separated by 2 inches. They're dated 40,000 years apart, and they're in the same rock. And the one that's supposed to be older is dated younger than the human. I think they're a little bit bonkers on these finds. That's why Leakey said, yeah, we need to do a whole lot more reclassifying because there's a lot of messes that they need to fix up. So people living in Europe today, Europe and Eurasia and some Asian descent, they have clearly defined Neanderthal genes. What does that tell you? When two people have the same gene, or let's pick 2 cats, lions and tigers, similar genes, that means they can interbreed. And they do. We have examples of ligers and Thailands that are crossed between tigers and lions. We have that in many different species. So if 2 people have similar genes, that means they can breed and have offspring. All of these dots here that you see are where they have found Neanderthal genes in the human genome. Which makes sense because if the Tower of Babel was here in the Middle East, everybody migrated from Babel when God confused all the languages, and they're scattered now all over the region. If you dressed Neanderthal up today in a suit and put him in a business meeting, nobody'd know who he was. He looks just like us. I've seen people like this. Maybe I look like this, don't tell me. Clearly human. Archaeological evidence now says that the Neanderthals were 100% human. They made sophisticated spears and needles and tools. They used makeup. Maybe Lucy got her makeup from the Neanderthals. Nice lipstick. They used to make seashell jewelry. They hunted dolphins and seals. They had controlled use of fire. They built homes from animal skins. They made flutes from femurs of bears so they could play music. They cared for their sick, and they buried their dead. All paleontologists and anthropologists now will say burying your dead is a religious ceremony. So either apes had religious ceremonies, maybe they believed in Jesus. We hope they did. They were clearly human. They were just like us. And at 4 different sites where Neanderthal fossils were found, Neanderthals and modern humans were buried together. Imagine that. Must have lived together if they were buried together. Finally, Cro-Magnon man, 1868. The best known human fossils of Cro-Magnon man are clearly 100% human, and everybody realizes that now. They're classified today as Homo sapien. This is some of the paintings in the walls of the caves in France. Beautiful paintings, but they also hunted woolly mammoths. That doesn't mean that they were becoming human. They were human, but they were hunting mammoths, which incidentally lived at the same time as humans did. There's evidence of spear points in mammoth skeletons. They hunted woolly mammoths, like I said. They made jewelry from teeth, shell, and tusks. They lived in rock shelters and caves. Does that surprise anybody? We believe, and this is a passage in the book of Job, we believe that Job talks about the Ice Age because it talks about how the broad waters had been frozen over. Where do you live? And this was probably only a couple of hundred years after the flood when people got off the ark and the Ice Age came. Where would you seek shelter from Ice Age cold? Where the temperature remains pretty constant all year round, in a cave. No wonder people painted on cave walls. A way to pass the time. Here's a passage in Job that says, they were driven forth from among men. They cried after them as after a thief, to dwell in the clefts of the valleys, in caves of the earth, and in the rocks. People in Job's days lived in caves, some of them. Look at Hebrews 11. Chapter 11 in Hebrews is kind of the hall of faith. Talks about all these great people that preceded us, and the great giant leaders that had lots of faith. Says, and others had trial of cruel mockings and scourgings, yea, moreover, bonds and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawed asunder, were tempted, were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and in mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. They lived in caves also. What else do we know? Sarah, Jacob, Lazarus, they were all buried in caves. Lot, Elijah, and David lived in caves, especially when David was running, my buddy Dave, especially when David was running from Saul, right? They lived in caves. So knowing from Scripture that God did not make ape men or men ape, we're 100% what God made us, there are only 4 ways to come up with ape men. And one is to combine ape fossil bones with human fossil bones and call it an ape man. Or we can emphasize certain human-like qualities of some fossils that were clearly ape and give them modern features like the whites of their eyes, lipstick, and make them look human, or emphasize ape-like qualities of fossilized humans to make them look more like an ape, or we can file them down and do whatever we need to make the shape that we need to have made, right? Just like Owen Lovejoy in the movie. A Japanese evolutionary biologist said this. He said, even with DNA sequence data, we have no direct access to the process of evolution. So objective reconstruction of the vanished past can be achieved only by creative imagination. And is that what we've seen? A lot of creative imagination based on the bias, the assumption that man has evolved from apes. And the question is, from which one? This is an article in National Geographic. It says, it's hard to find someone who can draw a realistic-looking early hominid. That's why the Geographic's art department conducted a search for new talent. 4 artists were picked to receive casts of 2-million-year-old female Homo habilis fossils. From these bits of evidence, they were to sketch in skeletal and fleshed-out form the hominid to whom the bones belonged. These are the bones that they were given. What kind of picture would you draw of these? I'd have no idea. This is what they drew. I've edited this for younger audiences. But this is what they drew. Look at the long arms and the long fingers and the hands. Clearly the bias is shown here that these bones belong to an ape. Now, Boyce Rebensberger is a writer and an author of science textbooks. He's written 4 scientific textbooks. In one of these, he says, in view of the paleoanthropologists, the story of human evolution has been fictionalized to suit needs other than scientific rigor. That's exactly what's happened. Richard Lewontin, an evolutionary biologist, said, when we consider the remote past before the origin of the actual species, Homo sapiens, of which we are faced with fragmentary and disconnected fossil record. Despite the excited and optimistic claims that have been made by some paleontologists, no fossil human species can be established as our direct ancestor. Well, at least this comes from an evolutionist. At least there's one honest one out there. It's not shaving bones down. So, is the history of human origins getting clearer or more confusing? This was a 1986 article on Australopithecines by Pat Shibby. An extraordinary 2.5 million-year-old skull found in Kenya has overturned all previous notions of the course of early hominid evolution. We no longer know who gave rise to whom, perhaps not even how or when we came into being. Article goes on to say, the bottom line of all this is that a great deal of work needs to be done. It's a new era in paleoanthropology. The things that we thought we understood reasonably well, we don't. No better argument can be made to support the time, the trouble, and the cost of field work than this new skull. Like an earthquake, the new skull has reduced our nicely organized constructs to a rubble of awkward, sharp-edged new hypotheses. It's a sure sign of scientific progress. That's different explanation of scientific progress. Don't know about you. As Christians, the Bible should be our starting point. No matter what the science indicates, we always need to start with the Word of God. He told us, He created us in His image, He's in authority, He sets the rules, because the only other thing to believe is nonsense made up from a bunch of bone scraps and lies that are so jumbled up right now that nobody knows up from down. 1 Corinthians 15, 38, 39. God gives us a body as he has determined, and to each kind of seed he gives his own body. All flesh is not the same. Men have one kind of flesh, animals another, birds another, and fish another. Acts 17, 24 to 26. The God who made the world and everything is the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples built by hands. He is not served by human hands as if he needed anything, because he himself gives all men life and breath and everything else. From one man he made every nation of men, that they should inhabit the whole earth. And he determined the time set for them and the exact places where they should live. God did this so that men would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him. That's the God that we serve. That's your history of human evolution tonight. Sorry I ran a lot over, so I appreciate your patience, but I had a lot of stuff to cover there. So, any questions? Otherwise, I'm going to have to let y'all go. It seems like a cult. Yeah, it absolutely is exactly that. And yeah, message needs to be spread. What evidence is really out there? Pretty slim. Let's go ahead and close in prayer, then I'll let y'all go. Heavenly Father, thank you that you are the God of all ages, the God of the Bible, who tells us how you made us, how you created us in your image, and you breathed in us the breath of life. Lord, thank you for the word that you have given us. Thank you for giving us logic, that we can look at the supposed evidence that was found that is contrary to your word. Thank you for letting us see the truth of your word and the lies of the modern scientists that have a religion of all their own. Lord, help us to spread that word and to spread the gospel so that more people would know that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. It's in his name that we pray. Amen.